mentioned, my name is Abby Satinsky. I'm the curator and head of public engagement for the Tufts Art Galleries. So you should come and visit us over at Eidechman Art Center or at SMFA. I'm going to start with a land acknowledgement. Tufts University Art Galleries acknowledges that we reside on the traditional homelands of the Massachusetts people and within the territories of the Nipmuc and the Wampanoag tribes who have cared, sorry, I'm like not used to doing this, who have cared for this land since time immemorial and whose relationships to this place endure. The genocide of the original inhabitants of this land, its historic and contemporary erasure, and the continued violation of sovereignty, territory, and waterways are the ongoing manifestations of settler colonialism that we benefit from and must work to transform. Since their formation, universities have been entangled in colonial knowledge production and dispossession. As a cultural institution situated within a university, we commit to learning and listening, unlearning, acting, and being in relationship to Indigenous communities and cultural life. So with that, we can start our program. I just wanted to say part of the reason that we were so excited to partner on this is that Erin Genia has a commissioned mural that is up at the Eidechman Art Center. It will be up for all year. It's called WAKPA, and I hope you'll talk a little bit about it. It is incredible. Please come and visit. It is in relationship to a show that we have up called Unsettling the Archive, which is curated by graduate student Natalie Guerin, and it's about Tufts land, specifically its land history, and some Indigenous artist responses to the archive as it stands. And so Erin is going to be giving a tour of her mural tomorrow at 2:30 p.m. So please come and see it in person and have that conversation then. So without further ado, I'm going to read some bios and I'll turn it over to the artists. They're going to talk briefly about their work and then they'll be in conversation with each other and then we'll have time for Q&A. Erin Genia Sisseton-Wahpeton Oyate is a multidisciplinary artist, educator, and community organizer specializing in Native American and Indigenous arts and culture. Genia has an MS in art, culture, and technology from MIT, and MPA in tribal governance from the Evergreen State College, and studied at the Institute of American Indian Arts. Mask. Her public art commissions include the Minnesota Historical Society, the City of St. Paul, and the City of Seattle. Genia lives and works in the greater Boston region. She was a 2020 artist in residence for the City of Boston and worked with the New England Foundation for the Arts public art team on the project Centering Justice, Indigenous Artists Perspectives on Public Art. And Erin is also teaching at SMFA right now. So very happy to have you. Elizabeth James Perry is an enrolled member of the Aquinnah Wampanoag tribe on the island of Nope, Martha's Vineyard. Her fine art focuses on northeastern woodlands, Algonquin artistic expressions, wampum shell carving and diplomacy, sustainable weaving, and natural dyeing methods. As a member of a nation that has long lived on and harvested the seed, James Perry's perspective combines art and appreciation for Native storytelling and traditional environmental knowledge in relationship to coastal North Atlantic life. She has spoken about her nation's wampum traditions on the podcast Indigeneity and has appeared in Native Peoples Magazine, Native Fashion Now, Catalog, and First American Art. And she was a recipient of the Massachusetts Cultural Council Traditional Artist Fellowship. She resides in South Coast, Massachusetts, where she works as an artist, educator, and exhibition consultant. Okay, with that, I will turn it over to the artists to speak. So, Erin, you have your own microphone.
Yes, can you hear me? Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you so much, Abby. I really appreciate your introduction, and thank you everyone for being here today and to the organizers for inviting us to this. It's so exciting to be here to merge art and environment in these concepts in this talk. So I just wanted to start off with this amazing picture of horn because look at how beautiful it is. This is something that my kids and I grew and harvested this year. I try to bring in natural materials into my artwork as much as possible. Oh, thank you. These are two pieces that I thought I would share with you. I work a lot with earthen materials as well. The piece on the left is called Antali, and it is a gourd. I work in the material of clay, and I also teach ceramics here at SMFA. And in this piece on the left, I thought I would show you this piece because this depicts the sun. And in Dakota culture, all aspects of the universe have life. They all have their own agency, and they're all part of a greater matrix of life forms. And so I wanted to show this by putting, a face into this gourd and using light in the piece. On the right-hand side, this piece is a clay vessel that is called Pit Mine Peril. And I have a whole series of pieces of vessels made from clay that explore the contours of the land that have been sort of desecrated and mined and extracted from through resource extraction, and that are in need of healing. So there's a lot of, a whole series that I have about that. Next slide, please. This piece is called Invisible, and you'll notice this, or maybe you won't notice it, but embedded within this image is a Dakota Oyate, which means morning star. And the morning star symbol is an embodiment of Dakota philosophy. There's a lot of things that are embedded within this symbol, and I use it a lot in my artwork. I come from a family of artists, and my uncles and aunts, my grandmother, my mother, my kids, we're all artists. And one of the things that my family does is they make these beautiful star quilts. So that's something that I've learned at a young age, and I continue to carry that through into my work. I made this piece in response to the widespread cultural supremacy that exists in our institutions. And it's made out of sort of this gossamer fabric that you can see through, and it serves two purposes. The first purpose is to provide kind of a symbolic skin of protection for me as I wear it against this pervasive Western cultural supremacy, and also to sort of show that, or to question how Western cultural supremacy, which extracts from people, which expropriates from peoples that are not within its traditions, and it sets itself as a standard. It's so permeating that it's almost invisible to those who are operating under it. So I thought that would be a good piece to show you, just to think about how really at the heart of so many of the environmental issues that we're facing is this Western cultural supremacy, which we can talk more about as we move on. Next slide, please. So this is a piece that I did called Earthling. It's a performative piece. And this is a very important piece for me because I have spent many years as a community organizer working in Olympia, Washington on a variety of different issues, including issues around environment, issues around economic justice, issues around Native American people's rights and tribal rights, as well as anti-war and all kinds of different issues. And one of the things that I noticed in doing that kind of organizing work was that I was constantly bumping up against Western philosophy and it was like a real dissonance that I was experiencing between my own Dakota philosophies and Western philosophies, in which the world is sort of seen as resources to extract from, and things are very individualized. So this is a way that I really wanted to explore and express this connection to Earth, which in Earthling, what I have been saying about this piece and through the performances, what I have been showing is that not only are we a part of the Earth, but we are actually the Earth itself. We are the Earth's body. We are elements of the Earth's body, and we're inseparable from the Earth. So what does that mean for us? How would if we were to understand that reality, how would our responsibilities to each other, to ourselves, to the world around us shift? So that's a question that I bring up in this piece. And also this quote at the top is a very important, I think it really sums up sort of the issues that I've been kind of placed in between. It's by Vine Deloria Jr., who is one of our preeminent scholars and leaders. He passed away. Thank you. But the work that I do comes from a Dakota canon. There are many Dakota and Lakota and Nakota people within the greater Otseseshakoin, which is our larger tribal group, who have been activists, who have been scholars, who have been writers, artists, performers, leaders, and we have our own canon. And so this quote, I'm not going to read it because of the time, but I just feel that this quote really sums up so much about sort of this dissonance that I've been trying to express. Next slide, please. So this piece, I think I may go a little bit beyond the 5 minutes. This is a piece that I recently did on the left here. I just installed it last week at BU, and I'll talk more about that in a second. But the reason why it came about is through work that I did as an artist in residence with the city of Boston. I was embedded in the Office of Emergency Management, and during that time, I witnessed how the office really, kind of took action to deal with the very serious public health emergency of the pandemic that we were experiencing last year. And I watched how the office worked. And with everything going on in the world, with the pandemic happening, with the very serious COVID-19 disparities that we're facing, particularly in my own communities, my own family, thinking about the economic injustices happening all around me, the terrible effects of climate change, fires and storms that all need emergency responses, the killings of Black people by police, and the Black Lives Matter movement. All of these things were sort of happening concurrently during this time and are still continuing. And I thought to myself that we need to have an emergency response at the level of culture, because it is our culture that is producing these harms, these emergencies. So I really began to explore, what does it mean to look at culture as an emergency, and what would a cultural emergency response be? So I created a website that you can look at the boston.gov website that really goes into that a little bit more. And I created this updated seal of the city of Boston with sea level rise, because it's coming. And what are we going to do about it? And it's very serious. It's a very serious issue, and yet we're not looking at it as a cultural issue. And since it stems from culture, we should be. So the piece on the left is one of my responses to this idea of cultural emergency response. And for me, as a Dakota person, what that means is looking at how I can approach these issues through stories and through traditional Dakota stories. So this is a sculpture, a sod sculpture of Ontehi, which is a Dakota water monster. Oh, sure. Is that better? Okay, thank you. And I used Ontehi to describe climate change, because as a water monster, this creature of legend becomes active when there's peril at sea, when there's flooding, when there's great storms and things. And so Ontehi has been activated at this site, which is really in Boston at BU, a site that is supposed to be, and that was, a tidal estuary. Next slide, please. And then finally, I wanted to talk about my mural, Wapka. Wapka is the Dakota word for river. And this is a piece that I did to express sort of my connection to the Mystic River. I live locally here in Medford, and I walk along the river very often, and my kids and I go to the river frequently, and we're always thinking about the river and asking questions about the river. And my kids and I did a collaborative sound piece called Continuity that is part of the Sound on Mystic installation. And I don't know if everyone is aware of this, but you can actually go to the river and walk along the river and download an app, and the app will trigger different sound pieces. And there's like about a dozen of them or so, and ours is one of them. And in this, we ask ourselves, my kids and I often work with my kids because they're artists too, and they're awesome. We ask, what did this place look like 400 years ago before settlers came? And what will it look like in 400 years? So through that, I wanted to sort of express the beauty that I felt towards this river. And I'll be working with students who are in my ceramics classes to place diamonds along the clay bed section of the Mystic River. Now, the Mystic River was home to many, many clay beds that really had served as a source of material, clay, to create the buildings of settlement and to create the industry of settlement. So the students have gone around and they've collected samples from the ground in places that mean something to them. And we've created these pigments with them, and they've painted the diamonds, and we're going to be applying the diamonds. We're going to be doing some testing today, but we'll be applying the diamonds next week. So the last thing I want to show you is just this time-lapse video. Since we can't go to the mural right now, I just wanted to show you this time-lapse video of its installation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Wanikisak, everybody. My name is Elizabeth James Perry. I'm Aquinnah Wampanoag. So my family is from Martha's Vineyard, and like a lot of Wampanoag people, I have ancestry throughout our territory in eastern Massachusetts and from nearby nations as well. I do have some ancestry from along the Mystic River, going way back too. My presentation is a kind of a combination of some of my photography of the landscape, some of my work in identifying place names that have been pretty badly butchered in the English language. So in our territory in southeastern Mass, there's Assunakik Beach, which is Stonehouse Place. It's a very historic area. It has beautiful commanding views of the ocean because there are these nice high dunes and beautiful grasses, and then you know, some pine barrens and wild cranberry bogs just behind them where it's more sheltered. These are places on the land. The headland of Martha's Vineyard, or Nope, is another one. These are really high ground where you can look out over the terrain. And as fisher people, as whale hunters and seal hunters, being coastal folks, having that view is really crucial. Also, if you've been in New England for more than 5 minutes, you know, the weather can get really special quite quickly. So another reason to keep an eye on the horizon is just to see what the weather has in store for you. My ancestry includes whalers. We did traditional whaling, of course, before settlers came. The resources in this area, you know, more broadly, Massachusetts, Eastern Rhode Island, and our territory, were extremely rich. It's still a very beautiful place to live, but it's, you know, so sparsely populated compared to what it would have been. So there's a kind of a deep sense of change and alteration. You go to the next slide. So in answer to some of what I see as kind of cultural and environmental devastation in the Boston area, a place that I would argue doesn't have a very strong sense of Native origin, a strong sense of continued relationship with Native people here and from across the country. I partnered with the MFA this year, actually starting last year. During the pandemic, it was a period when a lot of museums were at least intermittently closed. A lot of other institutions were as well. Folks were home, schools were closed. And we were talking about gardening and the possibility of designing a native garden outside the MFA. And part of the discussion also revolved around the Cyrus Dallin statue, which I've conveniently cropped out of the photograph here because I'm not a fan. We could get into that afterwards, but I wanted basically an Eastern answer to this statue that kind of others Native Americans and also kind of is a conglomeration and a stereotype of, so there's like a Western headdress and the squash blossom from the Southwest, and I'm not really sure what the moccasins are supposed to be. And the gentleman on the horse is underfed, and it looks a bit pathetic, for lack of a better description. So it's not really evocative to me and to my nation of tribal identity, tribal experience here in the Northeast. It isn't evocative of a city that's on the ocean and experiences those ocean breezes every single day, the presence of seabirds and historically at least seals and things like that. I designed a garden that was going to be something people could just enjoy freely from their car or from the train or walking by. Didn't have to go into the museum, just could be happening by. And I wanted people to be able to see it evolve over time, over the season. It's a combination of indigenous sedge grasses that have a lot of environmental value, both restoring soil and providing food and nutrients to birds and animals. There's indigenous corn that's growing right around the statue. And then we rimmed it with about 1.5 tons of my quahog shells that I use for my jewelry design and diplomacy and adornment and things like that. There's also, it was a multi-component project. So there's also a billboard next to the garden. This is the first incarnation. There's another one up there now. And I partnered with the African American artist Equa Holmes. She's a brilliant collage artist. And I selected family pictures of Aquinnah women. And there's a Narragansett woman in the upper right as well. And some art and elements of the garden. And these themes of regeneration, reconnecting, reclaiming land. And then there's a second version that's up now. If you want to go to the next slide. Thank you. It was really nice to hear. One of the nice things about the garden was there were, groups of children from the surrounding schools, diverse groups of children from the surrounding school systems that were touring the garden with some of the staff from the MFA. And one of them commented to the MFA, I'm negotiating a little spider here. One of them commented to the MFA staff that the billboard actually made them feel welcomed in the museum. And I thought that was particularly telling because they didn't look at the Dallin statue and say, oh yeah, that figure on the horse makes me feel super welcome. And like, I too can go to the museum. And I'm thinking, okay, that's been there for 100 and some odd years. The billboard's just been there for a few months and you're already seeing positive responses. Maybe that's something that should continue. In my work throughout my homeland, I use a variety of media. So I work with natural dyes. They're sustainable, they're non-toxic, they're storied, and we have a long relationship with these plants. I use deer skin and moose hide and things like that. I also use the quahog shell for wampum, which is a combination of adornment and diplomatic material, record keeping, for trade and just to cement, I guess, governmental and social ties. It's also useful, I think, as an artist to be able to communicate visually our values and traditions and identity. And so that's how I use the wampum. In the exhibit that I did for the New Bedford Whaling Museum, which is, you might guess, being whaling descendants, I was using the wampum to kind of highlight that and highlight some of our stories of the coastal beings that help to shape the landscape here from our traditions. And so I designed what I called a locket, but it's actually a really huge shell, very sculptural piece. I hand spun yards and yards and yards of Indian hemp. That's the natural color there. So like the strand of the necklace is like probably towards 40 inches long. And it has kind of a nautical, it's evocative of ropes and shipping ropes and nets and things like that and coastal living. And then the earrings were designed as a tribute to Squanch. So Moshup is a giant, and his wife Squanch is also a giant. She's actually bigger than him. She's a sea goddess in our tradition. And in a lot of the stories, Squanch actually has, multiple eyes, more than two. She's a different being. She's not very human necessarily. And I thought, well, if Squanch has multiple eyes, maybe she has multiple ears. So I designed these 6 earrings with a very ocean theme. There's whale, there's an underwater panther, there's a shark tooth. Sharks are very considered very protective. There's a singing face, and there's hailstones as well on the left from thicker, nicely patterned pieces. This is the project that I just completed with the MFA was multi-component, as I mentioned. And one of the things that I did, this is a bit of a bright picture, sorry about that, but it's purple and it's the purple and white wampum beads. They're really large and quite sculptural. I wanted to kind of capture and commemorate this project of creating the corn garden, knowing it was pretty ephemeral. It's just a year-long project. Once the garden is done, they'll remove the garden and that's it. But I wanted something to remember it by. So I took some traditional milkweed fiber that we use for our spinning and weaving, made the cordage, used bloodroot and logwood, which yield really handsome harvest colors, and made about 250 beads, and wove a corn effigy. So the purple is supposed to be the corn husk coming up, and then the white kind of goes wider and it tapers to the tip being an ear of corn. And these are just some other examples. So early on in my career as a wampum artist, it actually wasn't very popular. There were a few tribal members in Mashpee and Aquinnah working with wampum, but I think it wasn't, a lot of Native arts were kind of relegated to being crafts. They weren't necessarily celebrated in the broader public. They weren't necessarily shared too often, or they were only shared in terms of like, I don't know if you've ever been to Martha's Vineyard, but we have a couple of little tiny shops at the cliffs that are sort of our main, source of income from tourists in the summertime. It's quaint, it's interesting, it's distinctive, it's not satisfying. It's very sort of limiting, and it's not a way to really showcase fine pieces or large pieces. It's hard to have a really strong impact on folks that are only there for the length of the time it takes the bus to drive up there, wait for like an hour so they can grab lunch and then leave. There's problems. Anyway, it's very outdated. So I've really spent a lot of my time mining our stories and traditions and historical accounts, and taking time to relate to the few existing really nice early pieces of wampum and quill work and weaving that there are, both here and in international collections as well, and creating pieces that represent us, our beliefs in the values of good leadership, consistent leadership. The sun medallion embodies that. We're people of the first light, we're people of the East Coast. So that sun symbol is paramount, and leadership wore pieces like this because a good leader is supposed to embody those qualities, right? Of being constant, regardless of what the challenges are. And we've had plenty here for hundreds of years, that you're supposed to stay true to your people, take care of the earth and your homelands, and hand down a good legacy. There's a wampum belt as well that's pretty good size, and I was going for a very matrixy look. The shell is such a gorgeous natural material, but it's easy to lose sight of the origin of the material if you shape it in a way that really changes it from its original shell. So I wanted to have pieces that showed that layering. So you could picture these clams growing really slowly in that ocean layering and layering and getting wisdom and absorbing all of the seasons and everything going on, all the history and all the other beings in the ocean. It has a great richness and it's very expressive. And so that was my thinking, and I named it Out of the Ocean because, again, I'm not too fond of things that get taken out of context. And when tribal identity and local character and local environment are totally absented, it's a kind of erasure, I feel. So that's my way of trying to communicate the distinctive qualities about New England. I think I just have a couple. Sorry, it's too much of a long PowerPoint, I'm afraid. This is some woven quill work. So again, trying to use our traditional arts to showcase true Northeastern art rather than someone else's concept of what Native art is. So this is naturally dyed. This is porcupine quill art. This is us not wasting, using all aspects of the animals and fish and whales that we hunted and that we still depend upon and coexist with to this day. And next slide. Some natural textures. So there's corn husk. So that's another great use of corn and a way that we interacted, not just by eating. And you can make corn salty, and the corn is good for the earth, to mulch it and all. You can also use the leaves and the corn husk for art, and it's very durable and very strong. And it's also quite distinctive in terms of the sound it makes. If you flex the bag, once they're dry, it has an interesting rustling sound. There's an organic hand-spun hemp patterned basket. And so that's a soft fiber basket. It's got a very nice texture, really durable. There are a few examples surviving from the intervening centuries. They're very beautifully made, and there's so many additional embellishment techniques that combine with porcupine quill work and wampum and things. Next slide. And then again, art that incorporates Eastern materials. So there's antler and wampum, there's moose hide that's been hand spun into a 2-ply strand with very thick, large wampum discs, and a pendant that commemorates killer whales that are very rare in the Atlantic Ocean now. I was actually just having a conversation with folks yesterday about a lone killer whale that I've actually heard stories about him for 20 years plus. I know when I first heard about him, he wasn't new, and they call him Old Tom. And you can see him sometimes off by himself hunting in the Gulf of Maine, Bay of Fundy, and someday I'd love to see him. So that was a piece commemorating the killer whale. And that's my last slide. That's the Charles W. Morgan refurbished whale ship. I'm including it here because we had community members who worked on the ship and traveled the world on it. And I got a chance to actually spend some time on it when they sailed it again. It's a really interesting experience, and my contact information. Thank you for having me. Sure.
Thank you so much. I love your work so much. And I think one of the things that I didn't mention in my presentation is that I work in the traditional Dakota material of Chanita Iyon, also known as pipestone, and I am right now serving as an apprentice to Elizabeth to learn wampum. And so it's been a really amazing experience to think about.
Wearing her art. Sorry. Go ahead.
to think about how our the commonalities that we share in the work that we do.
Yeah, I was intrigued by the play piece that you had. I think you said it was part of a series. The devastation of mining, and around in this area we have a lot of sand mining. On the land a lot so far, but I think that there is at least talk, if not action, of sand mining in the ocean, which to me seems at best terribly risky because there's so much really vulnerable life. Yeah, I guess were you focusing on your homelands or?
I was looking at, I began by looking at my homelands because we have uranium mining happening there. There's a pipeline that's going through the Keystone, not the Keystone XL, but the Keystone pipeline is going through my reservation. We're close to the back end oil fields. And, I just, once I started looking at what's happening in my own, kind of territory, I then started to think about everywhere else that it's happening. A lot of it is happening in tribal territories. There's a lot of environmental racism. Companies will go in and completely destroy an area. They'll use up the water, they'll contaminate the water, just to get, a limited amount of whatever material is, gold, copper, all of the different elements that we use in our technology. And then once it's gone, they just leave a big mess. And so I really started to think about that and think about the materials that I was taught to use as an artist, paints and pigments and even clay. There's a traditional way of going and taking clay from the earth, and then there's a way the way that it's done to completely exploit it, which is how it was done here at the Mystic River. So yeah, just really thinking about what is my connection to the materials, not only that I'm using in my artwork, but also the materials that I use every day. Yeah, I think one of the interesting things that I've been thinking a lot about through our partnership is the role that the water plays in it. And the material of pipestone that I use, which is this little necklace here, shows us an example of it. It comes from a creek bed, and it's tied to stories about water. And then thinking about using the quahog shells, just coming directly from the ocean. And so thinking about this connection of the water in this collaboration that we're doing, it's really powerful. Even though my tribe is landlocked, not near the ocean, I've learned so much from you about all the different connections to the water that your people and that your traditions have.
I think it's interesting to grow up in New England because the ocean, I'm going to say up until now, we're about to have like 40 million wind farms in our territory. Yeah, my brother actually sardonically says it's to punish Aquinnah Wampanoag people, so they're all going to be like in our backyard, which is kind of it's a lot. It's a lot of sudden change, and it's got a potential for some risks to oil spills and things like that we're really concerned with. But it also on the land side, for hundreds of years, most of our rivers have been dammed. I think there's like one river in Massachusetts that hasn't ever been dammed. And so in terms of the landscape that I experience and that you're living in now, I try to kind of unpack things and go back to, okay, what does a river that hasn't been straightened out and stripped of the lining vegetation and beautiful grasses and muskrats and beavers and otters and everything else, all of the life, us as Native people are largely absented for various reasons, some of them really unpleasant as well. There's been so much change, and I just, an artist is imaginative and we can kind of envision things. And I'm curious to what degree artists could kind of harness that creativity to kind of vision us back to restoring landscapes, to healthy, healthful, and enjoyable systems that are sustainable, that aren't toxic. Because I don't know many artists who would dream of toxic landscape.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. And I guess one of the things that I have come into contact with is sort of this like idea that as Native artists, or even just as Native people, people from the dominant culture will be like, well, tell us how to fix this, or like, how do we, how can we sort of like use your ideas to like fix something, So there's like this sort of cultural appropriation and devaluing of us and the cultural gifts and the knowledge that we have. And I don't know, I think that's something that's really hard to deal with.
The time frame, right? So my friend has this expression. She says, "Oh, it doesn't have to happen at the speed of racism." Meaning, like, ironically, I find even unfortunately in the arts sector, folks will come to me and say, "Oh, we want to diversify. We want to be inclusive. We want to have, relationships. And we need you to tell us within a 3-month span all the things we need to do." And it's like, whoa. It's like a train going by at maximum speed. And then, when you come from cultures that prioritize getting to know people, finding common ground, building relationships, showing true commitment, and connection and investment, it doesn't happen in 5 minutes over, Zoom or a survey that, like, I sent to all my tribal members. Like, they'd really fill it out anyway, because I think, folks are really skeptical when you ask people for their ideas or their comments. I'm not sure that the faith is there, that things will happen and change the way that they need to. So yeah, there's I feel like there's also like a disconnect in terms of having patience and having character, and just wanting really quick, painless, magical solutions to problems. So I think the conversations can happen, but what if it has to happen in 3 generations of our families and not just, a 2-year initiative in Boston or something, 1-year garden? I don't know,
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Sure.
Oh, sure.
To the Q&A section now from the audience. So can you hear me now, Alex?
Yes.
Okay. So if there are any questions online, we can go back and forth between the room and the Zoom room.
Let's start in person and then we'll go online.
Hi, so you both mentioned working with museums and having institutional commissions, and those obviously are rooted in a history of colonization and appropriation of Indigenous art, and also just a focus on imperialist art. So I'm wondering how you've come across that in your work and how you've managed that and how to move forward from that.
I think that there's different ways to work with institutions and to kind of get them on the same page with Native people. I'm not sure if this is on, sorry. I think that there's a difference when an institution reaches out to living artists, living community members, designers, and supports us and our initiatives and our priorities and our focuses, and doesn't dictate. There's agency. I think, my big caution with institutions, and I've had to work on the other end, helping to identify really sensitive, NAGPR collections and things like that, for my tribe as well as other tribes. I think that educating the institutions about the need for agency. So for me as a cultural person, I can decide if something I make is appropriate. I feel it's okay for sale, okay for broad sharing. I need to be confident that it's going to be shared in a way that I feel is respectful and appropriate. The things that, for lack of a better term, were ripped out of people's hands, taken at gunpoint, dug out of the ground, there wasn't agency, there wasn't respect, there wasn't equality. So I think modeling an equal relationship is an excellent thing and something that needs to happen all the time. I think it's rare as an Northeastern Native person, and probably up and down the Eastern Seaboard, I'd say in general, actually. You know, there's such a pervasive myth of all the Indians east of the Mississippi are extinct. Well, that's a really convenient thing to say. For one thing, there were these huge initiatives, usually our resources and money and time on top of everything else, removing folks west of the Mississippi, right? So there's a tribe from Western Massachusetts and Eastern New York, the Mohican. And when we collaborate with them, as we do, because we have these shared cultural sites in Massachusetts, they have to fly back from Wisconsin. And so it's this sort of really self-serving narrative of they're all gone, we can do what we want, we can say what we want. No, there are plenty of us who are still here. Those of us who are moved are still connected and still care. So there's a really complex reality that has to be faced and dealt with. And again, it's the kind of thing that takes time. It doesn't happen overnight.
I guess I just wanted to also say that I've spent a lot of time in museum collections looking at Tanupa Eol pipestone pieces that are, as Elizabeth said, were taken from our people in ways that were really horrible, stolen really. And it can be really awful to know that the cultural treasures of your people are kind of kept away from your people in different places, and that the people don't have access to those things. So I think that museums are hopefully beginning to come around to different ways of approaching these objects, in particular by giving them back to the tribal nations that they belong to. And I will say that because in my culture, everything has life, that these pieces that are in the collections are actually considered to be ancestors. They're considered to be very sacred. And so, you know, so I think it's just a completely different way of looking at not only these pieces that are in museum collections, but also the world itself. So I wanted to add that. Thank you for the question.
Before we pass it to the Zoom audience. Yes, we have one here.
Would you all mind talking just a little bit more about like the apprentice relationship? Like what is that like? Like, do you share materials and talk through actual making? Is it also about sharing other, you know, your different knowledge sets and your communities? I just want to hear more about like your relationship that you all built over through this apprentice program that you're doing.
Yeah, sure. Well, I guess I can start by saying that I'm not from this place. I'm a Dakota person, but in my tradition, it's important to be very respectful and aware of the original people of the land that I'm on. And, you know, so I think that it's been through this relationship, it's been really important for me to like prioritize Elizabeth in my work, because she's from this place. This is her land, and she is the best person to really be speaking about issues of the land and culture from this area. So, with that, and not only that, but you have just decades of experience working in this material, and it's been really a big honor to do that. I've really been mostly focusing on how the material feels. It's very hard. Pipestone is very soft. So it's a very different kind of material to work with. And, you know, so we're thinking about pieces that we will produce together that will contain both media. And so it should be really interesting to see kind of what comes out of that.
Yeah, I guess I'm going to add too that it's, so we conceived of the apprenticeship before the pandemic. And then of course the pandemic hit, and there was a lot of like throughout New England panic going on all the time, and people were hoarding toilet paper, and it was kind of this really surreal just really surreal world to live in. And I found I was actually beginning to feel like skeptical of how creative we were going to be able to be, especially, you know, doubting that we were going to be able to meet and work hands-on, which I'm very hands-on with all my teaching. And when I actually sat down to work on it or prep materials to send or share, it was really refreshingly grounding, I think, to be able to work in the art, to be able to talk with other artists. It felt like a real anchor. So it was really, I think in the past, I've looked at collections of art and understood that they were produced in times of duress, you know, when all kinds of things were happening here during colonization. And I think sometimes I wondered, you know, how did that person or a group of people focus on creating this weaving or wampum or whatever the piece was? I think having had just a taste of some of that disruption, but also understanding that we're facing some bigger things with climate change, and understanding there's you know, forces that can interfere with your ability to tap into your traditional materials, to access lands safely, with climate change and other things happening. It really helped me be very much in the moment and really appreciate, I think, sharing perspectives, sharing the properties and appreciating anew the shell and all of the history and learning about the pipestone as well. Yeah, there's a lot to be said for art. And I think I don't even think it's, you know, broadly discussed, but it's extremely important.
Hey there. Thank you both. I have some questions I'm going to relay from online. I think each of them is relatively more directed to one or the other of you. From Luca Rogoff, I think this is a question for Erin. What was the material decision process like for the mural? Why did you land on what you did? And then from Sylvia Bottinelli, the question is, in your practices, wearable objects seem to play an important role. Can you expand on the interaction of your art with the bodies of both the viewers and the artists?
Thank you. With regard to the mural, it's a wheat paste, and so it's a digital image that I created at size that was printed out and placed on through a wheat pasting process onto the wall. And so in terms of that, it was something that was much more, I think it was just like, could have been, it was a quicker, it was a sort of like more temporary way to put some artwork on the wall to talk about these issues rather than doing like a painting or tiling or something like that. So that's about that. And the other, was the other question for me or was that for both of us?
I think it might have been for both.
Do you want to speak to that?
Sure. Yeah, I think so. In terms of my art forms, I think wearable art is really special, and I think it's accessible, it's touchable, it's less forbidding looking. But I think then also in terms of like Native culture, I think it's broadly, pretty broadly applicable. Things from our homeland, things from the ocean and the earth that we have a strong relationship, that we live in and enjoy and safeguard every day. They have this wholesome quality for us. We share an identity. It's not really so separate from us because we consider ourselves part of our homelands. And so it's wholesome, it's protective, it's positive, it's expressive. It's a way to share, you know, values of the natural world. It's a way to maintain contact and relationship be in relationship with the deer or the moose or the quahog clams, and think about the whales in our waters and what's going on these days and what's gone on over time. So I think that it's a very storied material, and having an opportunity, I think, to be an Eastern person and continue my art forms is something that's personally really satisfying and important to me. So I appreciate it and enjoy it.
And I would just add, from my perspective, I've done a lot of work, having been trained in traditional Dakota forms as well as Western style art. I've really been trying to think of like, what is art really to me? You know, what does it really mean to me? You know, in my museum research, I have been looking at these ancient pieces that go back, you know, in some cases thousands of years, and thinking these pieces were never made to be in a museum or on a wall or were, you know, in a collection like this. They were made to have a life of their own and to be in relationship with the people who made them and the people that they were made for. So I started to think of like, what does that mean for my art? You know, I don't want to make my art just for a wall, just for a museum space. I want to make it so that it can live, it can have a life, it can enhance people's life and have deep meaning for them and for myself. So that's one way that I look at it.
Well, we're going to have to leave it here, but thank you, Erin. Thank you, Elizabeth, for sharing your wonderful art and insights into it. And I would like to ask everybody to join me to thank them one more time.